A millionaire newly recovered from an accident is stopped by a young beggar who shouts while pointing at his fiancée, "Sir, she's not your wife." He begins to break out in a cold sweat, panicking as his memories start flooding back. The harsh, fluorescent lights flickered overhead as Alexander Morrison's eyes slowly adjusted to his surroundings. The sterile hospital room seemed to spin around him, its white walls closing in like a maze with no exit. His head throbbed with each attempt to remember how he'd gotten there, but his mind remained frustratingly blank, a vast emptiness where memories should have been. "Mr. Morrison, you're awake," a gentle voice cut through his confusion. A woman in scrubs approached his bed, her smile warm and familiar, though he couldn't place why. "I'm Sarah. How are you feeling?" Alexander tried to speak, but his throat felt dry and raw. Sarah quickly offered him water, her hand lingering on his as she helped him hold the cup. Something about her touch felt both comforting and oddly disconcerting, though he couldn't explain why. What happened?" he managed to ask, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah's expression softened with concern. "You were in a car accident 3 days ago. The doctors weren't sure when you'd wake up." She paused, her eyes filling with tears. "I've been so worried about you, Alex." The familiar use of his nickname struck him as strange, yet he couldn't determine why. Everything felt like a puzzle with missing pieces, each attempt to remember causing sharp pains behind his eyes. I can't remember anything," he admitted, panic rising in his chest. "The accident, this hospital, it's all blank." Sarah's hand tightened around his. "The doctors warned this might happen. You suffered a severe concussion. But don't worry, I'm here to help you through this." She hesitated, then added softly, We are very close, Alex." Alexander studied her face, searching for any spark of recognition. She was attractive, with kind eyes and a gentle demeanor, but try as he might, he couldn't connect her to any concrete memories. "How close?" he asked, his voice uncertain. Sarah's cheeks flushed slightly as she reached for something in her pocket. "We've been seeing each other for almost a year now. I work here as a nurse and we met during one of your routine checkups." She pulled out a photo showing them together at what appeared to be a charity event, both smiling at the camera. "How you've been such a wonderful partner, especially now." She trailed off, her hand moving unconsciously to her stomach. Alexander's eyes widened as he noticed the slight swell beneath her scrubs. "Are you?" "Yes," she whispered, tears spilling onto her cheeks. "I found out just before your accident. I hadn't had the chance to tell you yet. We're going to have a baby, Alex." The news hit him like a physical blow. A baby? A relationship? He searched desperately through the void in his mind, trying to find any connection to this life Sarah described, but found only emptiness. Yet the evidence was there in the photo, in her tears, in the gentle way she touched him. As he struggled to process this information, a strange scent caught his attention, something floral and familiar that triggered a flash of something, a memory, a dream. It slipped away before he could grasp it, leaving only a vague sense of unease in its wake. "I know this is overwhelming," Sarah said, squeezing his hand, "but we'll get through this together. The doctors say your memories might return gradually, or they might not come back at all. Either way, I'm here for you." Alexander nodded numbly, trying to reconcile the stranger's reflection in the window with the life Sarah described. He was clearly wealthy. The private room and the expensive watch on his wrist confirmed that much. But beyond these surface details, he felt completely untethered. As Sarah adjusted his pillows and checked his vital signs, Alexander noticed something else, a faint scar on her wrist that she quickly covered when she caught him looking. Had he seen that before? Should he remember its story? The questions piled up, each one leading to more uncertainty. Outside his room, the hospital corridors buzzed with activity, but Alexander felt impossibly isolated. Sarah's presence should have been comforting, yet something about it left him feeling even more alone. As darkness fell and the hospital quieted, he found himself staring at the photo she'd left behind, trying to understand how he could look so happy in a moment He couldn't remember. In the silence of his room, a soft breeze from the window carried that same elusive floral scent, and for a brief moment, he saw a flash of different hands, heard different laughter. But like smoke, it dissipated before he could grasp its meaning, leaving him with nothing but questions and the growing sensation that something wasn't quite right. The following week passed in a blur of medical tests, physical therapy, and Sarah's constant attention. Alexander found himself transferred to the estate he apparently called home, a sprawling mansion that felt as foreign to him as everything else. The grand entrance hall with its sweeping staircase and crystal chandelier seemed to mock his confusion with its familiar yet strange presence. Sarah had moved in to help with his recovery, explaining that she'd taken leave from her nursing duties to focus on his care. Her efficiency in navigating the house suggested familiarity, yet the older housekeeper, Mrs. Rodriguez, sometimes watched her with an expression Alexander couldn't quite read. "The lavender gardens were your favorite spot to relax," Sarah explained, as she guided him through the manicured grounds. The scent hit him again, stronger this time, causing him to stumble slightly. A flash of long, dark hair, different from Sarah's blonde waves, crossed his mind. "Are you all right?" Sarah steadied him, her touch gentle but somehow wrong. "Perhaps we should head back inside." "No," Alexander insisted, drawn to the lavender beds. "I want to stay here a moment longer." Something about this place felt genuine, in a way the rest of the estate didn't. He closed his eyes, breathing in the fragrance, feeling the whisper of a memory just beyond his reach. Sarah's phone buzzed, breaking his concentration. She stepped away to answer it, speaking in hushed tones that carried an edge of urgency. Alexander caught fragments of her conversation. "Not now. He's not ready. We need more time." "When?" she returned, her smile seemed forced. "Just work checking on my leave status," she explained, though Alexander noticed her hands trembling slightly as she tucked the phone away. Inside the mansion, Mrs. Rodriguez was dusting the library, a vast room lined with books that should have felt familiar but didn't. The elderly housekeeper paused in her work, watching Alexander with something like concern in her dark eyes. "Senor Morrison," she began hesitantly, "I was organizing your desk drawer and found this." She held out a small velvet box, but Sarah quickly intercepted it. "Oh, I'll take care of that," she said smoothly. "Alex needs his rest now." Later that night, unable to sleep, Alexander crept down to the library. The box sat in the top drawer of his desk, and his hands shook slightly as he opened it. Inside lay a delicate silver necklace with a lavender pendant. The sight of it sent a jolt through his system, a surge of emotion so strong it nearly knocked him over. "That was a gift for charity auction," Sarah's voice came from the doorway, making him jump. "You never got around to donating it." But something in her explanation felt wrong. The necklace in his hands carried weight beyond its physical presence. It meant something important, something he desperately needed to remember. "Why do I feel like that's not true?" he asked quietly. Sarah's expression flickered for just a moment before she composed herself. "The doctors warned us about this. False memories mixing with confusion. It's normal during recovery." She approached him, gently taking the necklace and returning it to its box. "You should be in bed, darling. Remember what the doctor said about rest." As she led him back to his room, Alexander caught a glimpse of movement outside the window. A small figure darted between the trees lining the driveway, illuminated briefly by security lights. A girl with a basket of flowers, her clothes worn, but her posture proud. "Did you see that?" he asked. But Sarah had already drawn the curtains. "Just the wind in the trees," she assured him. "Now please try to sleep. We have your first therapy session tomorrow." But long after Sarah had gone to her own room, Alexander lay awake, holding on to three things that felt real: the scent of lavender, the weight of the silver necklace in his hands, and the brief glimpse of the mysterious figure in his garden. Everything else, his supposed life, his relationship with Sarah, even the baby she carried, felt like a story happening to someone else, a story with crucial pages missing. In the distance, a dog barked, and for a moment, Alexander thought, he heard someone singing softly, a melody that tugged at his subconscious like a half-remembered dream. He drifted off to sleep with that song in his head, unaware that beyond his window, in the shadows of his estate, truth and deception were dancing a dangerous waltz, and the small figure with the flower basket would soon shatter his carefully reconstructed world. Rose clutched her basket of flowers closer as she watched the elegant mansion from her hiding spot behind the ancient oak tree. The evening air carried the sweet scent of lavender from the gardens, mixing with the fragrance of her own fresh-cut flowers. For 3 weeks now, she had observed the comings and goings at the Morrison estate, her heart growing heavier with each passing day. The small space under the bridge she called home wasn't far from here, allowing her to keep a careful watch on the deception unfolding within those grand walls. Her worn jacket and patched jeans might have marked her as an outsider in this wealthy neighborhood, but Rose's keen eyes missed nothing. She had seen too much, heard too much to stay silent any longer. "You're being ridiculous," she whispered to herself, running a hand through her tangled dark hair. "Who would believe someone like you?" But the memory of the conversation she'd overheard that rainy night wouldn't leave her alone. She had been seeking shelter from the downpour when she heard them. The nurse, Sarah, and a man whose voice dripped with barely contained anger. They stood in the shadow of the garden shed, thinking themselves alone in the storm. "The pregnancy test was positive, just like we planned," Sarah had said, her voice tight with tension. "He believes everything. The amnesia makes it perfect." The man's laugh had been cold. "And the real Mrs. Morrison's precious estate will soon be ours. Just keep him confused until the marriage paperwork is complete." Rose had knocked over a garden tool in her shock, forcing her to flee before she could hear more. But those words haunted her, driving her to learn everything she could about Alexander Morrison and the woman pretending to be his partner. During her daily flower sales near the estate, Rose had befriended Mrs. Rodriguez, the housekeeper. The elderly woman shared her concerns about Sarah's sudden appearance in Mr. Morrison's life, about how convenient the timing of everything seemed. "Something isn't right, Pequeña," Mrs. Rodriguez had whispered during one of their conversations. "The lavender gardens, they were Mrs. Morrison's pride and joy. Sarah claims they planted them together, but I remember when the real Mrs. Morrison designed that garden years ago." Now, as the sun set behind the mansion's towers, Rose watched Sarah pacing in the library, talking intensely on her phone. Even from this distance, the nurse's agitation was clear in her sharp gestures and rigid posture. A movement at the garden gate caught Rose's attention. The same man from that rainy night, tall, well-dressed, but with cold eyes, slipped onto the grounds, careful to avoid the security cameras. Rose pressed herself closer to the tree, her heart pounding as she recorded the encounter on her phone. Sarah met him by the lavender beds, their heated whispers carrying faintly on the evening breeze. "The lawyer is getting suspicious," the man hissed. "We need to speed this up." "I'm doing my best," Sarah snapped back. "His memories are completely gone, but something about this place keeps triggering something. He spent an hour in the lavender garden yesterday, just sitting there with this strange look on his face." "Then get rid of the garden," the man growled. "Tear it out, say it's triggering his anxiety. I don't care, just get him to sign those papers." Rose's fingers trembled as she stopped the recording. The proof was there, but how could she use it? Who would listen to a homeless girl accusing a respected nurse of fraud? The answer came to her as she watched Alexander himself step out onto the balcony, his expression lost and confused as he gazed over his own gardens. The truth had to come from someone he couldn't ignore. It had to come from her, directly and publicly. The annual Morrison Charity Gala was approaching, according to the gossip she'd overheard from passing socialites. Every important person in town would be there, including the family lawyer and Alexander's business partners. It would be her only chance to expose the truth before Sarah's plan succeeded. Rose reached into her basket, touching the small silver locket she'd found in the garden the day after the accident, a delicate thing with a pressed lavender flower inside and an inscription that read, "To my beloved Alexandra, forever in bloom." She had tried returning it through Mrs. Rodriguez, but Sarah had intercepted it, claiming it was just an old piece of jewelry for the charity auction. Looking up at Alexander's lonely figure on the balcony, Rose made her decision. She would need help, and she knew just where to start. Mrs. Rodriguez had mentioned a young lawyer who had been asking questions about the accident, someone who wasn't convinced by the official story. With renewed determination, Rose gathered her remaining flowers and headed toward the city. She had 1 week until the gala, 1 week to gather enough evidence to break through Alexander's manufactured memories. 1 week to save a man who didn't even know he needed saving. The preparations for the Morrison Charity Gala transformed the mansion into a hive of activity. Alexander watched from his study as decorators and caterers bustled about, each claiming to know exactly how he preferred things done, though their certainty only highlighted his own confusion. The lavender gardens had been partially cleared that morning, replaced with generic flowering shrubs that Sarah insisted would be less overwhelming for his recovery. The doctor agrees that too many strong sensory triggers could impede your progress, Sarah explained, her hand resting protectively over her growing belly, but Alexander noticed she wouldn't quite meet his eyes as she spoke. The changes in the garden created an unexpected hollow feeling in his chest. He found himself drawn to the few remaining lavender plants, their familiar scent bringing flashes of a woman's laugh, the soft brush of dark hair against his cheek, moments of joy that felt real yet remained frustratingly out of reach. Mrs. Rodriguez appeared at his office door, her expression troubled. "Senor Morrison, I found these while cleaning." She held out a stack of old photographs, their edges worn with handling. "Perhaps they might help with your memories." Before Sarah could intervene, Alexander took the photos. His breath caught. At the first image, himself years younger, standing in the lavender garden with a stunning woman with long dark hair. They both beamed at the camera, his arm around her waist, her hands cradling a bunch of freshly cut lavender. "Who is she?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Sarah quickly reached for the photos. "Just an old business associate. The doctors warned about forcing memories, remember? Let's focus on the present." But Alexander held onto the stack, moving to the next photo, the same woman, now in a chef's apron, laughing as she threw flour at the photographer, at him. The happiness in the image was palpable, real in a way his current life didn't feel. "Alexandra Morrison," Mrs. Rodriguez said softly, before Sarah could stop her. She loved to cook, especially on Sunday mornings. The kitchen always smelled. "To have fresh bread and—" "Mrs. Rodriguez," Sarah cut in sharply. "Don't you have duties to attend to? The gala preparations need supervision." The housekeeper hesitated, then nodded sadly and left. But her words had already taken root in Alexander's mind, sprouting questions that demanded answers. Later that evening, he found himself in the kitchen, drawn there by some subconscious pull. His hands moved automatically, reaching for flour, yeast, salt, ingredients he didn't remember knowing how to use but somehow felt right. As he worked, memories flickered like old film. Hands covered in flour, shared laughter, the smell of fresh bread mixing with lavender, a voice saying, "You're hopeless at this, Alex, but I love you anyway." The sound of breaking glass startled him from his reverie. Sarah stood in the doorway, a shattered water glass at her feet. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice strained. I'm not sure," Alexander admitted, looking down at his flour-covered hands. "It just felt familiar." Sarah's expression softened, but something about it seemed forced. "Oh, darling, you're confused again. You never baked. You always had staff for that. Come, let's get you cleaned up before the gala planning meeting." As she led him away, Alexander caught a glimpse of someone watching through the kitchen window, a young woman with a basket of flowers, her eyes wide with recognition. But when he looked again, she was gone. The planning meeting was a blur of decisions he was expected to make about an event he couldn't remember hosting before. The family lawyer, Mr. Chen, attended briefly, his keen eyes taking in Alexander's obvious discomfort. "The gala has always been Alexandra's," Mr. Chen began, but Sarah smoothly interrupted. "I think we should make some changes this year," she announced. "A fresh start, new traditions. The doctor agrees it would be better for Alex's recovery." Mr. Chen's expression remained neutral, but Alexander noticed him making careful notes in a small notebook. The lawyer's presence stirred something in his fragmented memories, discussions about trusts, about protecting assets, about ensuring everything was secure, just in case. That night, unable to sleep, Alexander returned to his study. The photographs were gone. Sarah had insisted on putting them away safely, but the memory of that laughing woman in the lavender garden wouldn't leave him. He opened his laptop, determined to search for answers, but found himself locked out of his own accounts. "I had them change the passwords," Sarah explained from the doorway, making him jump. "The doctors suggested limiting your exposure to potentially confusing information during your recovery." But as Alexander looked at her standing there, one hand resting on her stomach, the other clutching his phone, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was living someone else's life. A life carefully constructed to keep him from remembering his own. The law office of James Chen sat nestled between a coffee shop and a vintage bookstore. Its modest facade a stark contrast to the high-profile cases he handled. Rose stood outside, clutching her flower basket, gathering courage. Her worn reflection in the polished glass door reminded her of how out of place she must look in this professional setting. "You can do this," she whispered to herself, pushing open the door. The receptionist's raised eyebrows spoke volumes, but Rose stood her ground. "I need to speak with Mr. Chen about Alexander Morrison." "I'm sorry, but Mr. Chen is very busy with the upcoming Morrison Gala preparations. Perhaps you'd like to leave a message." "Tell him it's about Alexandra Morrison and the Lavender Gardens," Rose insisted, her voice stronger than she felt. "And about Sarah Williams' previous identity." The name drop worked. Within minutes, she found herself seated across from James Chen, his penetrating gaze evaluating her as she shared everything she'd witnessed. The recording from the garden played on his desk, Sarah's voice filling the quiet office. "This is concerning," Chen admitted, replaying certain segments. "I've had my suspicions about Ms. Williams, but proving anything has been challenging. She's very careful." Rose reached into her basket, pulling out a carefully wrapped bundle. "There's more. I found these in the garden after the accident." She revealed newspaper clippings from different cities, each telling a similar story. Wealthy men with memory loss, mysterious nurses who came to their aid, followed by quick marriages and drained bank accounts. Chen's eyes widened as he examined the clippings. "How did you obtain these?" "The internet cafe on 4th Street lets you print for free if you buy their day-old pastries," Rose explained. "I've been researching every night. The names are different, but the woman in the photos, it's her. It's Sarah." The lawyer leaned back, studying her with new respect. "You've taken an enormous risk gathering this evidence. Why?" Rose clutched the silver locket she'd found, its weight familiar after weeks of carrying it. "Because I know what it's like to lose everything. 3 years ago, I had a family, a home, a future. One financial disaster took it all. But this is different. This is someone deliberately taking another person's life apart. I can't just watch it happen." Chen nodded slowly, then opened his laptop. "Sarah Williams, or whatever her real name is, has built quite a convincing narrative. She's ingratiated herself with the hospital staff, charmed the household employees, and somehow accessed enough personal information to make her story believable." "But not everyone believes her," Rose interjected. "Mrs. Rodriguez, the housekeeper, she knows. Something's wrong. And I've seen Mr. Morrison in the gardens. Something about the lavender triggers real memories. Which is precisely why Sarah had most of it removed this morning," Chen added grimly. "She's eliminating anything that might jog his memory. The gala would have been Alexandra's 20th year hosting it. She turned it into the city's premier charitable event." Rose leaned forward eagerly. "The gala, that's our chance. Everyone who matters will be there. If we can prove Sarah's lying—" "It's not that simple," Chen cautioned. "We need concrete evidence. These newspaper clippings are suspicious, but they're circumstantial. We need to prove she's the same person, that the pregnancy is part of the con, and that she's manipulating Alexander's condition." "What about the hospital records?" Rose suggested. "From the accident? And Sarah's employment history?" Chen's expression shifted from cautious to intrigued. "The hospital records, yes. There might be something there. But accessing them legally would take weeks, and the gala is in 3 days." Rose stood up, smoothing her worn dress with determined hands. "Then we do it my way. I can get into the hospital. No one notices someone selling flowers, and I've learned that service entrances are rarely well monitored." "That would be illegal," Chen warned, but his tone suggested he was considering it. "More illegal than what she's doing to him?" Rose challenged. "I'm not suggesting we steal anything. Just verify some information, compare some signatures, see who was really on duty the night of the accident." The lawyer studied her for a long moment, then reached for his phone. "I have a contact in hospital administration. She's been concerned about some irregularities in the staffing records. Perhaps she'd be willing to take a closer look." Rose felt hope flutter in her chest for the first time in weeks. "We're going to need help from someone else too. Someone who's already inside the mansion." Chen raised an eyebrow. "Mrs. Rodriguez?" "Exactly. She sees everything, and Sarah doesn't consider her a threat. Plus, she has access to every room in the house." The lawyer began making notes, his professional demeanor giving way to focused determination. "If we're going to do this, we need to be careful. Sarah's not working alone. She has at least one accomplice we know of." "The man who visits at night," Rose confirmed. "I have photos of him too, taken from the garden." Chen cleared his desk, spreading out the evidence they'd gathered. "All right, let's build a plan. The gala gives us one chance to expose everything, but we have to be absolutely certain. One mistake and Sarah will make sure we never get close to Alexander again." As they began strategizing, Rose glanced out the window at the Morrison mansion, visible in the distance. The remaining lavender plants swayed in the breeze, their purple blooms a reminder of everything at stake. In her pocket, the silver locket seemed to grow warmer, as if responding to their growing hope of uncovering the truth. The Morrison mansion buzzed with pre-gala energy as florists, caterers, and decorators transformed the grand spaces. Alexander wandered through the controlled chaos, feeling like a ghost in his own home. Each designer and server greeted him with familiar deference, yet their eyes held questions he couldn't answer. Sarah fluttered from room to room, directing preparations with increasing urgency. Her pregnancy now visibly showed, and she used it to full advantage, garnering sympathy and deflecting questions with perfect timing. Yet Alexander noticed how her hand occasionally trembled when making decisions about the event's traditional elements. "The main hall always has blue hydrangeas," Mrs. Rodriguez mentioned quietly as she supervised the flower arrangements. "Every year, without fail." "We're making changes this year," Sarah interrupted, her voice tight. "White roses throughout. They're more elegant." She turned to Alexander with a practiced smile. "Don't you agree, darling?" Before he could respond, a commotion at the service entrance drew their attention. A young woman with a basket of flowers was trying to enter, only to be stopped by security. Alexander recognized her from the garden, the same mysterious figure he'd glimpsed several times. "I have a delivery," she insisted, her voice carrying across the marble floors. "Special orders for the gala." "We haven't ordered any additional." "Flowers?" Sarah said sharply, moving to intercept her. But Mrs. Rodriguez was quicker. "Ah, see, the lavender sprigs for the place settings," the housekeeper interjected smoothly. "I ordered them myself, an old tradition." Sarah's face tightened almost imperceptibly. "We don't need—" "I'd like to see them," Alexander interrupted, surprising himself. Something about the young woman's determined stance and the lavender's gentle fragrance pulled at him, demanding attention. The flower seller approached carefully, her dark eyes meeting his with an intensity that made him pause. As she opened her basket, the scent of lavender filled the air, and another memory fragment surfaced. A woman's voice saying, "Promise. Me will always keep the traditions alive, Alex. They're what make a house a home." "You remember something," the flower seller said softly, watching his face. It wasn't a question. Sarah quickly stepped between them. "Thank you for the delivery, but we won't be needing these. Security will show you out." "Wait," Alexander said, reaching for the basket. His fingers brushed against something metal hidden among the flowers, a familiar shape that sent a jolt through his system. But before he could investigate further, Sarah swayed dramatically, one hand pressed to her forehead. "Oh, I feel faint," she gasped. The attention immediately shifted to her, and in the confusion, the flower seller was ushered out. but not before she locked eyes with Mrs. Rodriguez in a look that spoke volumes. Later that evening, Alexander found himself in his study, trying to make sense of the day's events. The brief contact with the lavender had awakened something in him, a certainty that the life he was living wasn't truly his. He opened his desk drawer, searching for the silver necklace he'd found before, but it was gone. A soft knock interrupted his search. Mrs. Rodriguez entered, carrying a tea tray and a concerned expression. "Senor Morrison, there is something you should know about the gala." "Mrs. Rodriguez?" Sarah's voice cut through the air like a knife. "I believe the cleaning service needs direction in the ballroom." The housekeeper hesitated, then placed the tea tray down with a meaningful look at Alexander. As she turned to leave, he noticed something tucked beneath the saucer, a small folded note. "The preparation schedule for tomorrow is quite full," Sarah announced, moving to collect the tea tray. "You should rest, darling. Everything needs to be perfect for the gala." Alexander nodded absently, his mind on the note he'd managed to palm, before Sarah cleared the tea service. Later, safely alone in his room, he unfolded it with trembling fingers. In Mrs. Rodriguez's careful handwriting, it read, "Not everything is as it seems. Watch the flower girl at the gala. Trust your memories of the lavender." Outside his window, the last remaining lavender plants swayed in the evening breeze, their scent carrying on the wind like a warning. In the distance, a figure moved through, the shadows of the garden, the mysterious flower seller, her basket now empty, pausing to look up at his window with an expression of fierce determination. Tomorrow's gala loomed before him like a gathering storm, and Alexander couldn't shake the feeling that it would bring either his salvation or his complete undoing. As he drifted off to sleep, the scent of lavender followed him into his dreams, along with a woman's voice warning, "Be careful, my love. Not everyone who claims to care for you has your best interests at heart." The morning sun had barely risen when Rose slipped through the hospital's service entrance, her flower basket now filled with fresh bouquets for the nurses' stations. Chen's contact in administration had provided her with the perfect cover, a volunteer flower delivery program for patients. As she moved through the sterile corridors, her heart pounded against her ribs, but her steps remained steady. "These are lovely," the records department receptionist exclaimed, accepting a small arrangement. "We never get flowers down here." Rose smiled, carefully placing another bouquet near the filing cabinets. "I have more to deliver upstairs, but I noticed your water cooler is almost empty. Would you like me to fetch a new bottle from the supply room?" The receptionist beamed. "Would you? That's so thoughtful. The supply room is down the hall, third door on the left. The bottles are quite heavy, though." "Oh, I'm stronger than—" "Look," Rose assured her, accepting the key card. As soon as the receptionist left to care for her flowers, Rose moved swiftly. The personnel files were exactly where Chen's contact had indicated. Section H, Drawer 3. Her fingers trembled as she photographed Sarah Williams's employment records with her phone. Something wasn't right. The hire date was listed as 3 years ago, but the paper looked too new, the ink too fresh. And there in the corner, a telling detail. The hospital's logo was wrong. The current design had only been implemented 6 months ago. Moving to the patient records, Rose quickly located Alexander's file. Her breath caught as she read the admission notes. The attending nurse listed for the night of the accident wasn't Sarah Williams. It was Elena Martinez. Yet Sarah had claimed she was there, had told everyone she was working that night. A sound in the hallway made Rose freeze. Quickly, she snapped photos of the relevant pages and returned everything to its place. By the time the receptionist returned, Rose was arranging the last of her flowers, the evidence safely stored in her phone. "The supply room was locked," she said apologetically. "I'll try again later." Outside the hospital, Rose's hands shook as she called Chen. "The records, they're forged, all of them, and there's more. Sarah wasn't even on duty the night of the accident. She wasn't his nurse at all." "This is exactly what we needed," Chen's voice crackled through the phone. "I've been digging too, that man who visits her. He's been involved in several insurance fraud cases, but always manages to slip away before charges are filed. And I found something else, a marriage license application, dated for the day after the gala." Rose clutched her basket tighter, She's planning to marry him tomorrow, but how? He's not in any condition to— Money opens many doors, Chen interrupted, grimly. And there are always officials willing to overlook irregularities for the right price. But we have to be careful. If we move too soon, they'll destroy the evidence and disappear. The gala is tonight, Rose reminded him. Everyone who matters will be there. The hospital board, the family lawyers, Alexander's business partners. If we can expose her there— It's risky, Chen cautioned. Sarah's desperate, and desperate people are dangerous. We need to coordinate with Mrs. Rodriguez. She's our eyes inside the mansion. Rose glanced at her watch. The sun was climbing higher, and she could see the mansion in the distance, its windows gleaming with activity. I'll meet her at the service entrance in an hour. She's supervising the final preparations, and Sarah's too busy with the event planners to watch her every move. Be careful, Chen warned. Sarah's not working alone. Her partner could be anywhere watching. Rose ended the call and headed toward the mansion, her mind racing. The evidence was building, the forged records, the fake identity, the rushed marriage license. But something still nagged at her. Why this elaborate scheme? Why not simply take advantage of Alexander's confusion in simpler ways? The answer hit her as she remembered a detail from the hospital records, a notation about Alexander's medication, about how certain combinations could make a person more susceptible to suggestion, more likely to accept false memories as truth. Sarah wasn't just taking advantage of his amnesia, she was actively maintaining it. The realization made Rose's blood run cold. She had to find a way to get Alexander away from Sarah's influence, even for a few hours. But how? The woman barely left his side, and tonight's gala would be no exception. As she approached the mansion's service entrance, Rose saw Mrs. Rodriguez waiting, her face tight with worry. The housekeeper quickly ushered her into the relative privacy of the kitchen. They're setting up the main hall now, Mrs. Rodriguez whispered. Sarah's changed everything. The music, the decorations, the menu. It's like she's trying to erase every trace of the past. She is, Rose confirmed, showing the housekeeper the photos from the hospital. And tomorrow she plans to erase the last piece, Alexander's independence. We have to stop the wedding. Mrs. Rodriguez crossed herself, her eyes widening at the evidence. Dios mío, I knew something was wrong, but this is monstrous. We need your help, Rose pleaded. Tonight during the gala, we have to find a way to show everyone the truth. But first we need to get Alexander away from her long enough for the medication to wear off. The housekeeper's eyes sparked with sudden inspiration. The cellar, she said. Alexandra's wine cellar. Sarah doesn't know about the private tasting room. Mr. Morrison always hosted special guests there before the gala began. It's tradition. Rose felt hope flutter in her chest. Can you get him down there? Make it seem natural. Leave it to me, Mrs. Rodriguez assured her. But what about Sarah? She'll look for him. A small smile played at Rose's lips. Let me worry about Sarah. I have a special delivery planned for the gala, one that will keep her very busy indeed. The Morrison mansion glowed like a jewel in the gathering dusk, its windows spilling warm light onto the manicured lawns. Inside, the grand hall hummed with the voices of Silicon Valley's elite, all gathered for what promised to be an unforgettable evening. Alexander stood at the top of the main staircase, adjusting his bow tie with unfamiliar fingers, watching the scene unfold below. Sarah appeared at his side, resplendent in a midnight blue gown that emphasized her pregnancy. Remember, darling, just smile and let me handle the introductions. These people are all friends, but it's perfectly natural to feel overwhelmed. Her hand on his arm felt wrong somehow, too controlling, too possessive. The perfume she wore, an expensive floral blend, seemed to clash with the lingering scent of lavender that still clung to the evening air despite her best efforts to eradicate it. Mr. Morrison, a distinguished older woman approached, her silver hair elegantly styled. We've missed you at the symphony board meetings, and Sarah, dear, you're absolutely glowing. Alexander watched as Sarah smoothly handled the interaction, noting how she subtly steered the conversation away from any mentions of the past. It was a pattern he was beginning to recognize, this careful curation of his present reality. Senor Morrison? Mrs. Rodriguez appeared quietly at his elbow. There's a small issue with the wine selection for the main course. Would you mind checking the cellar? It's tradition for the host to make the final approval. Before Sarah could object, several board members approached her with questions about the charity auction, and Alexander found himself being guided away by the housekeeper. As they descended to the cellar, the sounds of the party faded, replaced by a cool silence that felt oddly comforting. "Through here," Mrs. Rodriguez indicated, leading him to a hidden door behind a wine rack. It opened to reveal a cozy tasting room, its walls lined with vintage bottles. A single glass of red wine sat on the antique table, along with a small plate of cheese and bread. "I'll handle things upstairs," the housekeeper assured him. "Take your time, senor. Some memories need quiet to return." Left alone, Alexander approached the table. The wineglass bore a faint lipstick mark, and beside it lay a handwritten note. "The truth is in the details. Look closely." His hand trembled as he picked up the glass. The vintage was familiar, a 1982 Bordeaux. Something about it tugged at his mind, a memory struggling to surface. He closed his eyes, inhaling the wine's bouquet, and suddenly there was there, a candle-lit evening in this very room, soft music playing from hidden speakers. A woman with dark hair laughing as she swirled her wine, teaching him about bouquet and finish. "You're getting better at this," she teased. "Soon you'll be as much of a wine snob as I am." The memory was so vivid, it made his chest ache. Opening his eyes, he noticed a photo album partially hidden behind a bottle. Inside, he found image after image of the woman from his flashes of memory, Alexandra. They were cooking together, traveling, working in the lavender gardens. Each photo told a story of deep love and shared joy. A noise at the door made him look up. The flower seller stood there, her simple dress replaced with an elegant cocktail gown, though her eyes held the same determined look he remembered. "I'm Rose," she said softly, "and I have something that belongs to you." She held out a silver locket, the one he'd been searching for in his study. Alexander took it with shaking hands. Inside, pressed between the silver faces, was a dried lavender sprig and an inscription, "To my beloved Alexandra, forever in bloom." "She's lying to you," Rose said gently. "All of it, the relationship, the baby, your past together. None of it is real. But the photos she showed me, doctored, just like the hospital records, just like her employment history." Rose placed her folder on the table. "Everything in here proves it. But you already know something's wrong, don't you? You feel it every time you smell the lavender, every time you look at the gardens she tried to destroy." Alexander sank into a chair, the weight of truth pressing against his chest. "Alexandra, she was my wife, wasn't she?" Rose nodded. "Sarah's been manipulating your medication, keeping you confused while she set up her final plan. She's arranged for you to marry her tomorrow, giving her legal control of everything." "Why are you helping me?" he asked, studying her face. "You don't know me." "Because 3 years ago, I lost everything to people who twisted the truth for their own gain," Rose replied. "I couldn't stand by and watch it happen to someone else, not when I could help." Above them, the sounds of the gala continued, a stark contrast to the quiet intensity of the cellar. Alexander stood, the locket clutched in his hand, fragments of memory slowly knitting themselves together. "We need to stop her," he said, his voice stronger than it had been in weeks. "We will," Rose assured him. "Mr. Chen is upstairs with all the evidence, and Mrs. Rodriguez has made sure the right people are ready to listen. But first," she gestured to the wine glass. "Finish that. It's been carefully selected to counteract the drugs Sarah's been slipping into your food. You need to be clear-headed for what comes next." As Alexander raised the glass to his lips, a familiar scent caught his attention. Mixed with the wine's bouquet was a hint of lavender, Alexandra's signature combination. In that moment, he felt her presence as clearly as if she stood beside him, lending him strength for the confrontation to come. The grand ballroom sparkled with crystal chandeliers and elegant decorations as Alexander made his way through the crowd, each step more purposeful than he'd felt in weeks. The effects of Sarah's medication were fading, allowing his mind to clear. like morning fog burning away in sunlight. Rose walked a few steps behind him, now dressed as one of the serving staff, her presence both subtle and reassuring. "Alex, darling," Sarah's voice cut through the murmur of conversation. She approached quickly, her midnight blue gown swishing across the marble floor. "Where have you been? The major donors are asking for you, and we need to announce the engagement." Before the main course, Alexander felt a subtle shift in his perception as he looked at her. Without the haze of medication, he could see the calculation behind her smile, the way her eyes darted nervously around the room. "Actually," he said, his voice steady, "I think we need to discuss something else first, like who Elena Martinez is." Sarah's perfect composure flickered for just a moment. "I don't know who that is, darling. You must be confused again. Let me get your evening medication." "The nurse who was actually on duty the night of my accident," Alexander continued, watching her face carefully. "Strange that you claim to be there when hospital records show otherwise." A string quartet began, playing in the corner, the elegant music a stark counterpoint to the tension building between them. Sarah moved closer, lowering her voice. "You're having one of your episodes, Alex. Remember what the doctor said about stress-triggering confusion?" "The doctor you hired?" Chen's voice came from behind them, smooth and professional. "Or should I say the actor you paid to play the part?" Sarah's hand tightened on Alexander's arm. "Mr. Chen, this is hardly the time or place for such ridiculous accusations. Alex needs his rest and his medication." Rose stepped forward, still in her server's uniform but standing tall. "The same medication that keeps him confused and compliant?" Heads were beginning to turn in their direction. Sarah's smile became brittle as she tried to maintain control of the situation. "Security, this server is harassing the hosts. Please remove her." "I wouldn't do that," Chen advised the approaching security guards. "Not unless you want to explain to the hospital board why you've been allowing an unlicensed person to dispense medication." He gestured to a group of distinguished-looking individuals who were now watching the scene with great interest. Sarah's composure cracked further. "This is absurd. Alex, darling, don't let them confuse you. Think of our baby." "You mean Thomas Walker's baby?" Alexander pulled out his phone, displaying the text messages Rose had discovered. "Your accomplice? The man you've been meeting in the garden at night?" The string quartet had stopped playing, and the ballroom had grown painfully quiet. Sarah's face transformed, her gentle demeanor falling away like a discarded mask. "You don't understand," she hissed. "Everything I did was for us. These people, they don't know you like I do. They don't care about you like I do." "Like you cared." "About the other men you've conned." Rose produced the newspaper clippings, holding them up for all to see. Different names, different cities, but always the same story. A wealthy man with memory loss, a caring nurse, a rushed marriage, and then empty bank accounts. Mrs. Rodriguez appeared with a laptop, displaying security footage from the garden. "The cameras you thought you'd avoided, Senora. They caught everything. Your meetings, your plans, your confession about the baby's true father." Sarah backed away, her hand protectively over her stomach. "This is all a lie. A conspiracy against us, Alex, after everything I've done for you." "You mean after everything you've done to me?" Alexander corrected, his voice gaining strength. He held up the silver locket. "You tried to erase her, Alexandra. You destroyed her gardens, hid our photos, kept me drugged so I wouldn't remember. But the lavender always brought her back to me, didn't it? That's why you hated it so much." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd as Sarah's facade finally shattered completely. Her eyes darted around the room like a trapped animal seeking escape. "Thomas!" she called out desperately. "Thomas, help me!" But her accomplice was already in custody in the foyer, Chen's private security team having intercepted him trying to sneak in through the service entrance. The evidence of their previous cons, their forged documents, and their planned deception was being displayed on screens around the ballroom, leaving no room for denial. As the truth unfolded before the shocked guests, Alexander felt a strange sense of peace wash over him. The fog that had clouded his mind for so long was lifting, and with it came the bittersweet rush of real memories. Not the manufactured ones Sarah had fed him, but genuine moments of love and joy with Alexandra. The scent of lavender drifted through the open doors from the few remaining plants in the garden, carrying with it the promise of renewal and healing. Rose stood quietly at his side, her mission accomplished, but her presence still offering silent support as his world realigned itself with truth. The aftermath of Sarah's exposure transformed the gala into something entirely different from its planned celebration. As security escorted her from the premises, the gathered guests buzzed with a mixture of shock, sympathy, and barely contained curiosity. Alexander stood in the center of it all, feeling simultaneously exhausted and more awake than he had in months. Mr. Morrison, Dr. Patricia Reynolds, head of the hospital board, approached with concern etched on her face. I cannot begin to express our horror at what has happened. A full investigation into our hiring practices and security protocols is already underway. Alexander nodded, but his attention was drawn to the garden doors. The evening breeze carried the sweet scent of lavender, and with it came more memories, clearer now without the haze of manipulation. The gardens, he said suddenly, turning to Mrs. Rodriguez. Alexandra's gardens. We need to restore them. The housekeeper's eyes filled with tears. Si, senor. I saved some of the plants when they were removing them. I kept them safe in the greenhouse just in case. Rose stepped forward, still in her server's uniform but standing with newfound confidence. I know a wonderful botanical garden that specializes in heritage plants. They can help restore everything to its original design. You seem to know a lot about gardens for a flower seller, Alexander observed with a small smile. I studied botanical science before. Rose hesitated, then continued. Before life took an unexpected turn, the flowers weren't just a cover. They're a piece of who I used to be. Chen approached with a stack of documents. The marriage license application has been invalidated, and I've already filed injunctions against Sarah and Thomas's access to any of your accounts. But there's something else you need to see. He handed Alexander a folder containing medical records, his genuine records this time. The accident wasn't as severe as Sarah led you to believe. Your amnesia was largely induced by the medication she was administering. With proper treatment, you should regain most, if not all, of your memories. I already am, Alexander replied, touching the silver locket in his pocket. Alexandra, she loved these gardens, created them from nothing. Every spring she would... He paused, overwhelmed by the rush of returning memories. Mrs. Rodriguez touched his arm gently. She would invite the local garden club to teach them about organic growing methods. And every year at the gala, she would give every guest a small potted lavender plant, Alexander finished, the memory crystallizing perfectly. A reminder to nurture beauty in their own lives. The remaining guests had gathered around, many of them nodding as they remembered this cherished tradition. Some were even sharing their own stories of Alexandra's kindness and vision for the annual charity gala. Then that's exactly what we'll do, Alexander declared, his voice stronger. Not tonight, but at the next gala. We'll restore the gardens, continue Alexandra's traditions, and make sure her legacy of helping others lives on. He turned to Rose, who was quietly trying to step back into the shadows. And I'll need help with that. Someone who understands both flowers and fighting for what's right. Rose froze, her eyes wide. Mr. Morrison, please call me Alexander. And before you say anything, Chen has already told me about your background. A botanical science degree from Berkeley, a promising career destroyed by corporate fraud. That left you homeless. You didn't just help me because it was right. You helped because you know what it's like to have your life stolen by people you trusted. The young woman's eyes filled with tears. I never wanted anyone to know it. To judge? Judge? Alexander gestured to the gathered crowd. These people just watched a nurse try to steal my life and fortune through elaborate deception. I think they've learned something about not judging by appearances. The remaining guests murmured in agreement, many of them looking at Rose with new respect. Mrs. Rodriguez beamed proudly, as if she had known all along that things would work out this way. So, Alexander continued, would you consider becoming our new head of botanical operations? The gardens need restoration, and the charitable foundation needs someone who understands both beauty and justice. Rose's hand flew to her mouth in shock. Are you serious? Completely. After all, you've already proven you can handle complex projects and research, and something tells me Alexandra would have approved of someone who fights for the truth, with flowers as her weapon. The scent of lavender seemed to grow stronger, as if in agreement. Through the open doors, the moon illuminated the remaining plants in the garden, their purple blooms swaying gently in the evening breeze. Spring arrived at the Morrison estate in a wave of color and fragrance. The lavender gardens, carefully restored over the winter months, had begun to bloom again, their purple flowers stretching toward the sun like tiny natural cathedral spires. Rose stood among them, clipboard in hand, directing a team of gardeners with quiet confidence. 3 months had passed since the dramatic revelation at the gala, and the changes were evident everywhere. The mansion's halls, once cold and imposing, now buzzed with purpose as the charitable foundation's new headquarters took shape. But nowhere was the transformation more apparent than in the gardens. The heritage varieties are thriving, Rose explained to Alexander as they walked the grounds together, a morning ritual they'd developed. Mrs. Rodriguez was right. Those original plants she saved were incredibly resilient, just like their original gardener. Alexander smiled, touching a lavender sprig gently. His memories had largely returned, though some days were clearer than others. The doctors had assured him that with time, everything would settle into place naturally. Alexandra would have loved what you've done here. She always said gardens should be both beautiful and purposeful. Rose nodded, consulting her notes. That's why I've designed the new section as a teaching garden. Local schools can bring students to learn about sustainable growing practices, just like she used to do. And look, the first crop from our greenhouse program is ready. She led him to a state-of-the-art greenhouse, where neat rows of potted lavender plants waited. Each pot bore a small tag explaining its purpose, some medicinal, others culinary, all part of the Foundation's new community outreach program. Hard to believe this all started with a basket of flowers and a desperate plan, Rose mused, adjusting her now professional attire, a far cry from the worn clothes she'd worn while selling flowers on the street. Speaking of new beginnings, Alexander said, Chen mentioned you've been helping him with other cases, something about corporate accountability. Rose blushed slightly. Just consulting. My experience, well, both with botanical science and with losing everything, it gives me a unique perspective. We've already helped 3 other victims of corporate fraud recover their assets. They reached Alexandra's favorite reading nook, a small stone bench surrounded by climbing roses and lavender. Alexander sat down, his expression thoughtful. I've been meaning to ask you something. The Foundation's annual gala is coming up next month. Everything's on schedule, Rose assured him quickly. The invitations are ready, the garden tours are planned, and Mrs. Rodriguez has the catering under control. Actually, Alexander continued, I was wondering if you'd consider being my co-host. Not just as the head of botanical operations, but as a partner in the Foundation's mission. Your story, your resilience, it embodies everything Alexandra believed in. Rose stared at him, momentarily speechless. But the social circles, the donors, I'm not... You're exactly what they need to see, Alexander interrupted gently. Someone who understands both sides of fortune's coin. Besides, you've already impressed half of Silicon Valley with your garden restoration project. A gentle breeze carried the lavender's scent around them, and Rose was reminded of that night months ago when she'd first dared to hope she could make a difference. I found something yesterday, she said, reaching into her pocket. While we were replanting the east border, she held out a small weathered garden marker, its handwritten label faded but still legible. Lavandula angustifolia, Alexandra's hope. May it bloom forever. Alexander took the marker carefully, his eyes bright with memories. She created this variety herself, said it was hardy enough to survive anything, just like love. He looked up at the flourishing gardens. She was right. The sound of a car approaching drew their attention. Chen's sleek vehicle pulled up the driveway, and the lawyer emerged with a stack of documents. The final paperwork, he announced as he joined them. Sarah and Thomas's plea deal is complete. They've agreed to full restitution to all their previous victims. And the Foundation will help those victims rebuild, Rose added firmly. Just like it helped me. Alexander stood, surveying the gardens that had become both a memorial and a promise of future hope. The morning sun caught the dew on the lavender blooms, creating tiny rainbows that seemed to dance among the flowers. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "Alexandra always said that gardens are like life. They need equal parts love, dedication, and forgiveness to truly flourish. Even after what Sarah did, I think she'd want us to focus on healing rather than retribution." Rose touched a lavender bloom gently. "That's why each of these plants will go to someone who needs a reminder that beauty can grow from adversity. Every pot, every bloom carries that message." The three of them stood in companionable silence, surrounded by the evidence of renewal and restoration. In the distance, a school bus approached, the first group of students coming to learn about more than just gardening. They would learn about resilience, about second chances, and about the power of truth to overcome deception. The week before, the new gala transformed the Morrison estate into a hub of purposeful activity. In the main hall, Mrs. Rodriguez supervised the placement of elaborate flower arrangements, each one featuring Alexandra's special lavender variety, alongside roses and wildflowers grown in the teaching gardens. "A little to the left," Rose directed, her confidence evident in her posture. Gone was the uncertain flower seller. In her place stood a woman who had found her purpose. "We want the evening light to catch the blooms just right. Just like Alexandra used to arrange them," Mrs. Rodriguez noted with approval. "She always said the flowers should dance with the light." Alexander watched from the doorway, a warm smile playing on his lips. The past months had brought healing he hadn't thought possible. His memories, though not all fully returned, had settled into a comfortable clarity. The fog of confusion that Sarah had manufactured was long gone, replaced by a sharp appreciation for truth and authenticity. "The guest list has grown," Chen remarked, joining him with a tablet in hand. "Seems word has spread about the Foundation's new direction. Every major tech company wants to be involved in the Corporate Accountability Initiative." "Rose's influence," Alexander replied. "Her story resonates with people, shows them that success isn't just about wealth, it's about what you do when everything is taken away." In the garden, students from the local community college's horticultural program were setting up displays about sustainable growing practices. Rose had insisted on making education a central part of the gala, turning it from a simple charity event into a celebration of growth and renewal. "Mr. Morrison?" A young student approached shyly. "Miss Rose told us about the special lavender variety. Would you tell us about Mrs. Alexandra's vision for these gardens?" Alexander led the students to Alexandra's reading nook, now restored to its former glory. She believed that gardens could heal more than just the earth. Every plant here was chosen not just for its beauty, but for its ability to help others. As he shared stories about Alexandra's work, Rose quietly organized the evening's presentation materials. Each guest would receive not only a potted lavender plant, but also information about the Foundation's new mission, supporting victims of corporate fraud and helping them rebuild their lives. "The presentation boards are ready," she announced, joining them, "including the before and after photos of the garden restoration, though I still think we should include the picture of me selling flowers on the street." "It's important for people to see the whole journey," Alexander agreed. "To understand that appearances can be deceiving, both when judging someone's worth and when trusting those who seem above suspicion." Mrs. Rodriguez appeared with a tray of lavender tea, a knowing smile on her face. "And speaking of journeys, Señorita Rose, I believe you have some news to share." Rose blushed slightly but stood tall. "The Botanical Research Center has accepted our proposal. We'll be partnering with them to develop new therapeutic gardening programs for trauma survivors." "Alexandra would have loved that," Alexander said softly. "Using the gardens to help people heal and grow." The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, creating patterns on the polished floors that reminded Alexander of the day he'd first begun to question Sarah's deception. But now, instead of confusion and doubt, the light brought clarity and purpose. "There's something else," Rose added, pulling out a small photo album. "Mrs. Rodriguez helped me find these in the attic. They're pictures of Alexandra teaching her. First gardening class here. I thought maybe we could display them at the gala, show how we're continuing her legacy." Alexander opened the album carefully, and memories washed over him, not painful now, but warm and inspiring. Each photo showed Alexandra sharing her knowledge and passion with others, her face alight with purpose. "Perfect," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "This is exactly what the gala should be about, remembering the past while nurturing the future." Chen cleared his throat. "The Foundation's legal framework is complete too. Everything Alexandra worked for is now protected and expanded. The gardens, the education programs, the support services, it's all secured for generations to come." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the lavender beds, the estate hummed with anticipation for the coming event. But more than that, it radiated a sense of rightness, of purpose restored and enhanced. Rose stood in the garden's center, surrounded by the fruits of her labor and the promise of tomorrow. "Sometimes," she mused, "the most beautiful blooms grow from the hardest seasons." Around her, the lavender swayed in the evening breeze, releasing its calming fragrance. Nature's reminder that healing and growth were constant possibilities, waiting only for the right combination of care, courage, and truth to flourish. The evening before the gala, Rose stood in her new apartment, running her fingers over the elegant dress laid out on her bed. The deep purple gown, with its subtle shimmer and flowing lines, represented everything that had changed in her life over the past months. Through the open window, she could see the lights of the Morrison estate glowing in the distance, no longer a symbol of unattainable luxury, but a reminder of how life could change in unexpected ways. "You're going to look beautiful in it," Mrs. Rodriguez said from the doorway, having arrived to help Rose prepare for tomorrow. "Alexandra would have loved seeing you wear her favorite color." Rose turned, emotion catching in her throat. "Alexander told me it was her gown from their first charity gala together. I still can't believe he wants me to wear it." "It's perfect," the housekeeper assured her, stepping into the room. "You carry the same spirit she did, the desire to help others, to make beauty grow in unexpected places." The apartment, modest but comfortable, was filled with potted plants and botanical sketches. A framed certificate from the Botanical Research Center hung on the wall, alongside photos of the restored gardens. On her desk sat a stack of case files, more victims of corporate fraud that she and Chen were helping through the foundation. "Sometimes I wake up thinking I'm still under that bridge," Rose admitted, touching the silver locket Alexander had given her for safekeeping. "That all of this has been a dream." Mrs. Rodriguez took her hands warmly. "But it's not a dream, mi querida. You earned this through your courage and determination. Now let me show you how to style your hair for tomorrow." Alexandra had a special way with the lavender sprigs. As the older woman worked, Rose's mind wandered to the morning's final gala preparations. The guest list had swelled to include not just Silicon Valley's elite, but also activists, educators, and survivors of corporate fraud who had been helped by the foundation. "The teaching garden looks magnificent," Mrs. Rodriguez commented, pinning another strand of Rose's hair. "Those children from the community center couldn't stop talking about their vegetable plots." Rose smiled, remembering the excitement on their faces. "That's what Alexandra wanted, isn't it? Not just beauty for its own sake, but beauty that serves a purpose, that helps people grow." "See, exactly that." Mrs. Rodriguez stepped back to admire her work. "There. Now you look like what you truly are, a guardian of her legacy." A gentle knock at the door interrupted them. Alexander stood there, holding a small box. "I hope I'm not interrupting, but there's something I wanted to give you before tomorrow." Rose invited him in, conscious of how different this felt from their first interaction, when she had been a desperate flower seller, trying to reveal the truth about Sarah. "Alexandra wore these at our first gala," Alexander said, opening the box to reveal a pair of delicate lavender earrings. "They're not just jewelry, they're a reminder of what we're truly celebrating tomorrow." "Second chances," Rose whispered, touching the earrings gently. "New beginnings growing from difficult times." "And truth," Alexander added, "the kind that blooms even when people try to bury it." He looked around her apartment, taking in the evidence of her new life. You know, when you first tried to warn me about Sarah, I thought you were just another person trying to take advantage of my confusion. I've never been so glad to be wrong. Mrs. Rodriguez discreetly wiped away a tear. Life has a way of bringing the right people together at the right time. Even through difficult circumstances, through the window, the sunset painted the sky in shades of purple and gold, matching the colors of the gardens below. Rose could see the event tents being set up, the lights being strung through the trees, all in preparation for tomorrow's celebration. "I've been thinking," she said carefully, "about starting a mentorship program through the foundation, connecting people who've rebuilt their lives with those who are just beginning the journey." Alexandra's face lit up. Alexandra would have loved that idea. She always said that healing happens best in community. "And speaking of community," Mrs. Rodriguez interjected, "wait until you see what the garden club has planned for the ceremony. Tomorrow." Even the mayor was impressed during the preview. As they discussed the final details for the gala, Rose felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. The frightened, desperate woman who had once sold flowers on the street hadn't disappeared. She had transformed, like a garden after winter, into something stronger and more purposeful. The lavender sprigs in her hair released their gentle fragrance, reminding her of that rainy night when she'd first overheard Sarah's deception. What had started as an attempt to prevent an injustice had blossomed into something far more significant, a complete renewal of purpose, not just for her, but for an entire community. The morning of the gala dawned clear and bright, with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of lavender through the Morrison estate. In the master suite, Alexander adjusted his bow tie, pausing to look at a photo of Alexandra that now sat proudly on his dresser. The morning light caught the silver frame, creating a subtle glow around her smiling face. "She would have loved today," Mrs. Rodriguez said softly, entering with his morning tea. "Everything about it speaks of her vision. Beauty with purpose, elegance with meaning." Alexander nodded, touching the photo gently. "I keep thinking about how different this is from last year's gala. The deception, the confusion. And now, here we are, celebrating truth and renewal." The estate hummed with activity as final preparations were made. In the teaching garden, student volunteers arranged displays showcasing their sustainable growing projects. The greenhouse doors stood open, revealing rows of potted lavender plants ready for distribution, each one representing a story of hope and resilience. Rose arrived early, looking transformed in Alexandra's purple gown. The lavender earrings caught the morning light as she moved through the gardens, checking final details and greeting early arrivals. Several young women from the Foundation's support program followed her, learning the art of event management as part of their professional development. "The corporate accountability panel is set up in the library," Chen reported, tablet in hand. "We've got CEOs, ethics professors, and 3 of our success stories ready to speak. The press is already calling this the most significant charity event of the year." "Not charity," Rose corrected gently. "Empowerment. That's what Alexandra believed in, isn't it, Alexander? Giving people the tools to rebuild their own lives." Alexander smiled, watching as more guests began to arrive. Among them were faces he now knew well, survivors of corporate fraud who had found new purpose through the Foundation's programs, community leaders who had supported their initiatives, and even some of Sarah's previous victims, now restored to financial stability and dignity. The gardens had been transformed into an elegant outdoor venue, with paths winding through the lavender beds, leading to various educational stations. Each turn revealed another aspect of the Foundation's work, from sustainable agriculture to corporate ethics, from community education to individual empowerment. "Mr. Morrison," a young girl ran up, her school uniform identifying her as one of the community center students. "Look, our tomatoes won first prize in the sustainable growing competition." Alexander knelt to examine her ribbon proudly. Alexandra always said that the best gardens grow more than just plants. They grow confidence and pride too. More guests arrived, filling the gardens with conversation and purpose. Rose moved among them with natural grace, sharing the story of the Foundation's evolution and her own journey from selling flowers on the street to becoming its co-director. "It's amazing," one of the corporate executives commented to Alexander. "She bridges worlds, helps us understand both sides of Fortune's coin, makes us see beyond our boardroom bubbles." The morning progressed smoothly toward the opening ceremony. Tables laden with organic refreshments provided by local community gardens dotted the lawn. Students guided tours through the teaching gardens, proudly explaining their projects to interested donors. In a quiet moment, Alexander found Rose standing in Alexandra's reading nook, adjusting a display of vintage gardening books. "Ready for your speech?" he asked gently. Rose touched the silver locket at her neck. "I think so. It's strange. A year ago, I was trying to get someone to listen to the truth about Sarah. Now I'm about to address Silicon Valley's elite about corporate responsibility and second chances. Life has a way of planting us exactly where we need to grow," Alexander quoted, recognizing one of Alexandra's favorite sayings. "I found something this morning," Rose said, reaching into a pocket hidden in the gown's folds. She pulled out a weathered journal. It was pressed between these books, Alexandra's garden diary. "Look at the last entry." Alexander opened it carefully, his heart catching at the familiar handwriting. "Gardens, like life, require faith in invisible processes. We plant seeds in dark soil, trusting in future blooms. Sometimes the most beautiful gardens grow from the most unexpected circumstances. Always believe in the power of truth to rise, like a seedling reaching for the sun." Through the window, they could see the gathered crowd, the restored gardens, and the promise of new beginnings. The breeze carried the scent of lavender, wrapping around them like a blessing from the past, a guide for the present, and a promise for the future. The terrace. Afternoon sun cast long shadows through the lavender gardens as guests gathered for the gala's keynote address. The event had already exceeded all expectations, with pledges of support pouring in from corporations and private donors alike. But the most anticipated moment was yet to come, Rose's speech about transformation and truth. She stood at the podium, Alexandra's purple gown catching the light, the scent of lavender surrounding her like a protective embrace. The gathered crowd fell silent, tech moguls and former street dwellers alike waiting to hear her words. "A year ago," Rose began, her voice clear and steady, "I stood outside these gates selling flowers, watching a deception unfold and wondering if anyone would believe the truth when it came from someone like me." She touched the silver locket at her neck. "What I didn't understand then was that truth, like the flowers I sold, has its own power to bloom." In the front row, Alexander sat with Mrs. Rodriguez and Chen, pride evident on their faces. The students from the Community Gardens program watched attentively, many of them holding notebooks to record her words. Alexandra Morrison understood something profound about gardens and life, Rose continued. She knew that the most beautiful blooms often come from the most challenging conditions, that every plant, like every person, deserves the chance to grow toward the light. She gestured to the restored gardens around them. "These grounds are more than just a beautiful space. They're a living testament to resilience." When Sarah tried to erase Alexandra's legacy by destroying the lavender gardens, she didn't understand that truth, like these plants, has deep roots. It might be buried, but it never truly disappears. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Many present knew the story of Sarah's deception, but hearing it reframed as a story of growth and renewal gave it new meaning. The foundation for truth and renewal isn't just about exposing corporate fraud or helping its victims, Rose explained. It's about believing that every person deserves the chance to rebuild, to find their purpose, to bloom again after life's winters. She pointed to the teaching gardens where students' projects flourished. "Look at what grows when we give people the tools and trust they need. These gardens now feed 3 local shelters. Our corporate accountability programs have helped recover millions in stolen assets. But more importantly, we've helped restore something money can't buy, dignity and purpose." Alexander watched as Rose's words touched the audience. Wealthy donors wiped away tears, while students stood straighter, recognized for their contributions. Even the press corps seemed moved. their cameras momentarily forgotten. Alexandra believed that gardens could heal more than the earth, Rose continued, her voice softening. She saw them as places of transformation, where past pain could be turned into future purpose. That's why every guest today will receive not just a lavender plant, but a commitment from our foundation to support their own journey of growth. She held up one of the potted plants, its purple blooms vibrant in the afternoon light. These aren't just party favors, they're promises. Each one represents our pledge to maintain Alexandra's vision of a world where truth and beauty work together, where second chances are nurtured, and where every person has the opportunity to grow into their full potential. The breeze picked up, carrying the scent of lavender across the gathering. Rose touched the silver locket again, drawing strength from its presence. A year ago, I was homeless, hopeless, but still determined to fight for truth. Today, I stand before you as living proof that with the right support and opportunity, anyone can transform their life. She gestured to the various displays around the garden. Look around you. Every project, every program, every bloom you see represents someone's journey from darkness to light. The corporate executives who now mentor fraud victims, the students teaching sustainable agriculture, the survivors helping others rebuild. This is Alexandra's legacy in full flower. As she concluded her speech, the setting sun broke through the clouds, bathing the gardens in golden light. The lavender swayed gently, creating waves of purple that seemed to ripple with appreciation. Let these gardens remind us that no matter how harsh the winter, spring always returns. Truth, like nature, cannot be permanently suppressed. It will always find a way to bloom. The applause that followed was thunderous, but it wasn't just applause. It was a recognition of shared purpose, of lives transformed, of truth triumphant. As Rose stepped down from the podium, Alexander met her with tears in his eyes. Alexandra would have been so proud, he whispered, not just of the gardens, but of everything they now represent. The impact of Rose's speech rippled through the gathering like waves in a pond. As guests mingled in the gardens afterward, conversations buzzed with renewed purpose and inspiration. Corporate leaders huddled with foundation members, discussing expanded support programs. Students eagerly shared their projects with potential mentors, while survivors of fraud found comfort and strength in connecting with others who understood their journey. Alexander watched it all from Alexandra's reading nook, now transformed into a quiet memorial space. Photos of her working in the gardens lined the walls, along with pressed lavender specimens and quotes from her gardening journals. The space perfectly captured her spirit, practical beauty in service of healing and growth. Your wife would have loved this, Chen said, joining him with 2 glasses of champagne. The foundation has already received pledges for twice our annual budget. But more importantly, look at the connections being made. Indeed, throughout the gardens, unlikely pairs engaged in deep conversation. A tech CEO learned organic growing techniques from a formerly homeless student. A corporate fraud survivor shared recovery strategies with a young entrepreneur. The barriers that usually separated social classes had melted away, replaced by shared purpose. Rose approached, still radiant in Alexandra's gown, but now carrying a stack of business cards and pledges. The Botanical Research Center wants to expand our therapeutic gardening program to 5 more locations, she announced excitedly. And 3 major corporations have committed to funding our whistleblower protection initiative. None of this would have happened without you, Alexander said softly. You didn't just save me from Sarah's deception. You helped create something even more meaningful from that experience. Mrs. Rodriguez appeared with a fresh pot of lavender tea, her eyes bright with happiness. And look at our students. 2 of them have already been offered scholarships to study sustainable agriculture. Alexandra always said education was the key to lasting change. The evening light filtered through the garden's trees, creating a magical atmosphere as staff began, lighting the thousands of tiny lights strung throughout the grounds. Each illuminated path led to another display of the Foundation's work, from the Corporate Accountability Center to the community gardens, from the Education Pavilion to the Healing Gardens. We've had an interesting request, Chen mentioned. checking his tablet. Several universities want to use our program as a case study in corporate ethics classes. They're particularly interested in how we combine practical support with ethical education. Rose nodded thoughtfully. We could develop a curriculum around it. Use the gardens as both metaphor and practical training ground. She smiled at a memory. From selling flowers to designing university programs, life really does bloom in unexpected ways. A group of young children ran past, clutching their potted lavender plants and chattering excitedly about where they would plant them. Their enthusiasm perfectly captured the spirit of the evening, hope taking root, ready to grow. I have something to show you both, Alexander said, leading Rose and Chen to his study. On his desk sat a framed photograph taken just that morning. Rose in Alexandra's gown, surrounded by blooming lavender, her face alight with purpose. Beside it stood another photo, Alexandra in the same gown years ago, wearing the same expression of determined hope. The parallels are remarkable, Chen observed. Different women, different times, but the same spirit of using beauty to heal and transform. Rose touched the photos gently. Not just beauty, she corrected. Truth. Alexandra understood that real beauty comes from authenticity, from living and sharing truth, even when it's difficult. Through the study windows, they could see the gala continuing in the gardens. The lavender glowed purple in the evening light, while hundreds of tiny lights twinkled like earthbound stars. Guests moved through the illuminated paths, each carrying their potted plants, symbols of the promise to nurture truth and support renewal. You know, Alexander said thoughtfully, when Sarah tried to erase Alexandra's presence from these gardens, she actually ended up making it stronger. Every attempt to suppress the truth just made it grow back more resilient. Mrs. Rodriguez joined them carrying a special box. And speaking of resilience, she said, opening it to reveal a collection of lavender seeds, these are from Alexandra's original plants. I've been saving them for the right moment. Rose's eyes lit up with understanding. For the new teaching gardens, she breathed, we can use them to start the next generation of healing spaces. As they stood together, the scent of lavender enveloped them like a blessing. Outside, the gardens continued to work their magic, transforming strangers into allies, pain into purpose and truth into beauty that would bloom for generations to come. As the gala wound down in the late evening hours, the gardens took on an almost magical quality. The tiny lights twinkled among the lavender like fallen stars, and the cool night air carried whispers of possibility. Most guests had departed, leaving behind an atmosphere of accomplished purpose and renewed hope. Rose walked the illuminated paths alone, her purple gown trailing softly through the grass. She paused at each display, straightening a sign here, adjusting a flower there, her mind replaying the day's events. In her pocket, she felt the weight of dozens of business cards from supporters and the warmth of heartfelt notes from those touched by her speech. I thought I'd find you here. Alexander's voice came softly from behind. He joined her, looking relaxed and content for the first time in months. You know, Alexandra used to do the same thing after every event. Walk the gardens alone, processing everything. Rose smiled, touching a lavender bloom gently. I keep thinking about that first night, hiding in the rain, overhearing Sarah's plans. How desperate and alone I felt. Now look at all this. She gestured to the gardens, the educational displays, the evidence of lives transformed. You turned a moment of crisis into a catalyst for change, Alexander observed, just like these gardens, beauty growing from difficult circumstances. They walked together in comfortable silence, passing the greenhouse where students' projects flourished. Through the glass, they could see the next generation of lavender plants, grown from Alexandra's preserved seeds, ready to spread hope to new locations. Mrs. Rodriguez told me something interesting, Rose said finally. She said Alexandra always believed that gardens had their own way of choosing their caretakers, that the right person would appear when needed. Alexander nodded, remembering. She used to say that people were like plants. They just needed the right conditions to reveal their true strength. He paused at the reading nook, now cleaned and restored after the day's activities. I think she would have seen you as proof of that belief. Inside the nook, they found Chen organizing the last of the donation pledges. His usual professional demeanor had softened, touched by the day's events. "The final numbers are remarkable," he reported. "But more importantly, look at these." He held up a stack of handwritten notes from participants. Rose began reading them aloud. "Thanks to the foundation, I found the courage to start over. The gardens taught me that healing takes time, but it's worth the wait. I never thought I'd feel hopeful again, but today changed everything." "Real impact," Alexander said softly. "Not just numbers on a spreadsheet, but lives actually transformed." Mrs. Rodriguez appeared with a tray of herbal tea, her face glowing with satisfaction. "The kitchen staff found something while cleaning," she announced, pulling an old envelope from her pocket. It was tucked behind Alexandra's favorite recipe box. The envelope contained a letter, written in Alexandra's flowing hand. "Alexander, read it with trembling fingers. To whoever finds themselves caring for these gardens next, remember that every flower has its season, every person their purpose. The gardens may change, but their power to heal and transform remains constant. Trust in the truth that blooms here." Rose felt tears welling up. It's like she knew somehow, like she understood that these gardens would need to evolve, to serve new purposes. "She always said that the best gardens grow beyond their gardener's original vision," Alexander replied, carefully folding the letter. "That each caretaker adds their own layer of meaning and purpose." Through the windows, they could see the last of the cleanup crew finishing their work. The gardens glowed softly in the evening light, the lavender swaying gently in the breeze, as if nodding in agreement with their conversation. "Tomorrow," Rose said, pulling out her notebook, "we start planning the expansion. 3 new teaching gardens, 5 healing spaces, and the corporate ethics center. Alexandra's vision growing in ways she might never have imagined, but somehow always knew were possible." "And what about you?" Alexander asked gently. "How does it feel becoming the guardian of such an important legacy?" Rose touched the silver locket at her neck, then looked out at the gardens that had changed her life. "It feels like coming home," she said simply. "Like all those years of struggle were just preparing me for this moment, this purpose." As if in response, a warm breeze carried the scent of lavender through the nook, wrapping around them like a gentle embrace. The gardens, their silent witness, continued their eternal cycle of growth and renewal, now enriched with new purpose and deeper meaning. The morning after the gala brought a new energy to the Morrison estate. The gardens, freshly tidied after the previous night's celebrations, sparkled with dew as the sun rose over the restored lavender beds. Rose arrived early, dressed now in practical gardening clothes, ready to begin the next chapter of their journey. She found Alexander in the greenhouse, already examining the seedlings that would become part of their expansion project. The tender shoots reached toward the morning light, much like the foundation itself, young, full of potential and growing stronger every day. "The first shipment leaves for the new teaching garden next week," he announced, carefully checking the growth charts. "Alexandra's original lavender variety, ready to inspire a whole new generation of gardeners and healers." "And look at this," Rose replied, opening her tablet to show him the morning's emails. 3 more corporate whistleblowers have reached out for support. Chen's already arranging legal counsel and protective services for them. Mrs. Rodriguez entered with their morning tea, carrying it on Alexandra's favorite tray. "The community center called too," she added. "Their waiting list for the gardening program has doubled since last night. People are calling it the Hope Project now." They gathered around the greenhouse's central workbench, where architectural plans for the expansion lay spread out. The original gardens would remain the heart of their work, but new spaces would soon branch out, each designed to serve a specific healing purpose. "The Corporate Ethics Center here," Rose pointed, "with meditation gardens and meeting spaces. Then the therapeutic gardens on the east side, designed specifically for trauma recovery programs. And look, the university wants to add a research wing to study the impact of horticultural therapy on corporate burnout." Alexander smiled, recognizing Alexandra's influence in every aspect of the plans. She always said that gardens could heal more than just the earth. Now we're proving it on a scale she might never have imagined. Through the greenhouse windows, they could see students arriving for the morning's programs. Young people from all walks of life, each carrying their own stories of challenge and hope, ready to learn the art of growth and renewal. "I've been thinking," Rose said, pulling out Alexandra's garden journal. "What if we publish this, not just as a gardening guide, but as a blueprint for transformation?" Her wisdom about growth and healing seems more relevant now than ever. Alexandra touched the worn cover gently. She would have loved that, especially knowing it would help others find their way through difficult seasons. Chen arrived with more news. The Foundation's story had caught national attention. Media requests were pouring in, not for sensational coverage of Sarah's deception, but for in-depth features about corporate accountability and innovative healing programs. "They're calling it the Lavender Revolution," he reported, showing them the headlines. A new approach to corporate ethics and personal renewal growing from one garden's transformation. As they discussed the future, a small group gathered by the original lavender beds caught their attention. A young woman, recently rescued from corporate fraud, was sharing her story with two executives, their expensive suits incongruous among the garden tools and soil. "That's what Alexandra meant," Rose said softly, watching the unlikely group interact. "About gardens breaking down barriers. Look how natural they seem together, how the setting itself encourages honesty and connection." Mrs. Rodriguez nodded wisely. "The gardens have their own magic that way. They don't care about titles or bank accounts. They respond only to care and attention." The morning sun climbed higher, illuminating the greenhouse and its precious cargo of growing plants. Each seedling represented a promise of new beginnings, of truth prevailing, of beauty rising from adversity. "You know what this means," Alexander said, looking at the expansion plans. "We'll need more help, more people who understand both the practical and healing aspects of this work." Rose smiled, thinking of her journey from selling flowers on the street to directing this ambitious program. "I might know some people," she said. "There's so much hidden talent out there just waiting for the right opportunity to bloom." Together they stepped out into the gardens, where the day's activities were beginning. Students prepared soil for new plantings, corporate leaders rolled up their sleeves for hands-on learning, and survivors found peace among the swaying lavender. The breeze carried the familiar scent, Alexandra's special variety of lavender, now blooming more abundantly than ever. It was a reminder that some legacies don't fade, but rather grow stronger, adapting and evolving to serve new purposes while keeping their essential truth intact. 1 month after the gala, the Morrison Foundation's impact had spread far beyond its original gardens. The morning sun illuminated a scene of remarkable transformation. Construction crews carefully breaking ground for the new Corporate Ethics Center while preserving the integrity of the existing gardens. Rose supervised the work, her tablet filled with sustainable design plans and program schedules. "The first satellite garden opens next week," she told Alexander as they walked the grounds together. "The Children's Hospital is especially excited about the therapeutic gardening program. They're already seeing improvements in their long-term patients, just from having the plants in their rooms." Alexander watched a group of corporate executives participating in their weekly gardening therapy session. These powerful figures, now dressed in casual clothes and working with their hands in the soil, were learning lessons about growth and authenticity that no boardroom could teach. "I received another letter from Sarah," he said quietly, pulling an envelope from his pocket. "She's completing her rehabilitation program and teaching gardening to other inmates. Says working with plants has helped her understand the damage she caused and want to make amends." Rose considered this thoughtfully. Alexandra's journal had something to say about that, about how gardens can heal even the deepest wounds if we let them. Maybe that's part of our mission too, helping people find their way back to truth no matter how far they've strayed. Mrs. Rodriguez approached with excitement in her eyes. The university research team just arrived. They're setting up their equipment in the East Garden to study the effects of lavender on stress reduction and emotional healing. The research project was just one of many new initiatives. The foundation had become a hub of innovation, combining traditional gardening wisdom with cutting-edge therapeutic techniques. Each day brought new visitors, corporate leaders seeking ethical guidance, trauma survivors finding peace among the blooms, students learning about sustainable practices. "Look at this," Chen called from the newly established tech center. He pulled up a global map dotted with bright points of light. Every light represents someone who's reached out for help since the gala. Corporate whistleblowers, fraud survivors, people looking to create their own healing gardens. Rose studied the map with wonder. It's like Alexandra's legacy is creating its own ecosystem. Each person we help goes on to help others, and the impact keeps growing. In the teaching gardens, a former corporate fraud victim was now leading a workshop on financial literacy, using gardening metaphors to explain complex concepts. Her students, a mix of executives and community members, worked together, breaking down the social barriers that had once seemed insurmountable. "We've received an interesting proposal," Alexander mentioned, showing Rose a detailed presentation. "Several major corporations want to establish ethics gardens in their headquarters. Based on our model, they're calling it the Lavender Initiative, using sustainable gardening to promote corporate transparency and healing." Rose smiled, remembering her days selling flowers on the street. From one garden to many, from one truth to a movement. Alexandra would have loved seeing how her vision has evolved. The afternoon brought a special ceremony, the graduation of their first class of corporate accountability advocates. 20 individuals from diverse backgrounds had completed the Foundation's comprehensive program, combining ethical business practices with therapeutic gardening techniques. "Today you take Alexandra's legacy into the world," Rose addressed the graduates. "Remember that like these gardens, truth and healing require constant nurturing. Every small act of authenticity, every moment of compassion contributes to the greater bloom of positive change." As the graduates received their certificates, each was given a potted lavender plant, cuttings from Alexandra's original gardens. These plants would travel to new locations, spreading both beauty and purpose, just as their students would spread the principles they'd learned. The day concluded with an intimate gathering in Alexandra's reading nook. Alexander, Rose, Mrs. Rodriguez and Chen sat together, surrounded by the evidence of their success and the promise of future growth. "Sometimes I wonder," Rose mused, touching the silver locket that never left her neck, "if all of this was somehow part of Alexandra's plan. Not the specific events, but the way her garden became a catalyst for such widespread healing." Through the windows, they could see the sun setting over the lavender fields, now more extensive and vibrant than ever. The original plants had not just survived, but thrived, spreading their beauty and fragrance across the expanded grounds. Each bloom seemed to carry a piece of Alexandra's vision, now reaching far beyond the garden walls to touch lives across the globe. On a quiet Sunday morning, exactly 1 year after Sarah's deception had been exposed, Rose stood in the center of the newly expanded lavender gardens, preparing for a special ceremony. The foundation had grown beyond anyone's expectations, but this day was about returning to its roots, both literally and figuratively. "Everything's ready," Mrs. Rodriguez announced, arranging the last of the ceremonial lavender bouquets. Each one contained blooms from Alexandra's original plants, now thriving in their restored garden beds. "The first graduates of our worldwide program are arriving." From across the globe, people had come to participate in this moment. Corporate leaders who had transformed their companies through ethical reforms, survivors who had rebuilt their lives through the Foundation's support, and new gardeners trained in Alexandra's methods of healing through horticulture. Alexander joined them, carrying a small wooden box crafted from the old garden bench where he had first begun to question Sarah's lies. "Found something remarkable in Alexandra's old files," he said, opening the box to reveal a collection of carefully preserved seeds. These were from her first lavender plants, the ones she used to start everything. Rose touched the seeds gently, understanding their significance. Perfect for today's ceremony. A piece of the past, helping to grow the future. The morning's event was more than just a graduation ceremony. It was a celebration of truth's power to bloom, even in the most challenging circumstances. Each participant would plant new lavender seeds while sharing their story of transformation. "Look who's here," Chen called softly, gesturing toward the garden entrance. A familiar figure stood there, Sarah, now changed by time and rehabilitation, her presence approved by the Foundation's board as part of their commitment to complete healing. "The garden welcomes everyone seeking truth," Rose said, quoting Alexandra's journal. She approached Sarah with a quiet confidence that would have been impossible a year ago. "Would you like to join us?" Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she nodded. "I've been working with plants in the rehabilitation program," she said quietly. "They've taught me more about honesty than any therapy session. When you nurture something real, something true, it changes you." The ceremony began as the sun reached its morning height. One by one, participants stepped forward to plant their seeds and share their stories. Corporate whistleblowers spoke of finding courage through the Foundation's support. Fraud survivors described rebuilding their lives with newfound purpose. Garden therapy graduates explained how working with plants had healed their emotional wounds. When it was Sarah's turn, she planted her seeds with trembling hands. "I came here thinking I could create false happiness through deception," she admitted. "But real joy, like these gardens, can only grow from truth." Rose watched it all from Alexandra's reading nook, now expanded into a wisdom-sharing space filled with journals and gardening guides. The Foundation's global impact was evident in the faces before her, people from different countries, cultures, and backgrounds, all united by their connection to these gardens and their message of authentic growth. "Alexandra's vision has come full circle," Alexandra observed, joining her. "From a private garden to a worldwide movement, yet still rooted in the simple truth she always believed, that healing and growth require nurturing authenticity." Through the windows, they could see the next generation of gardening students arriving for their afternoon classes. The Foundation now offered everything from basic horticulture to advanced therapeutic techniques, all infused with Alexandra's philosophy of truthful growth. "You know what still amazes me?" Rose said, touching the silver locket. "How one person's dedication to authentic beauty could create such far-reaching change. Alexandra never knew how her gardens would transform lives across the globe." Mrs. Rodriguez brought them tea in Alexandra's favorite cups, a ritual that had become even more meaningful with time. "But perhaps she did know," the housekeeper suggested wisely. "Not the specific way, but the potential. She always said gardens had a way of growing beyond their boundaries when planted with pure intentions." As the ceremony concluded, the participants gathered for a traditional garden blessing. The scent of lavender filled the air, stronger and sweeter than ever, as if Alexandra's spirit was present in every bloom, celebrating this moment of complete renewal. As twilight descended on the Morrison estate, casting long shadows through the lavender beds, Rose stood in the exact spot where she had once hidden on that rainy night, watching truth struggle to bloom. The gardens had transformed beyond recognition, yet their essential spirit remained unchanged, a testament to the power of authentic growth and renewal. "The last of today's participants are leaving," Alexander said, joining her among the flowers. "But look what they've left behind." He gestured to the hundreds of newly planted lavender seedlings, each one representing a story of transformation, each one carrying Alexandra's legacy forward. "From one garden to 1,000, Rose mused, touching a delicate purple bloom. "And each new garden becomes a center for truth and healing in its own way." Mrs. Rodriguez approached with a special delivery, a book, fresh from the publishers. "The first copy," she announced proudly. "Gardens of Truth, Alexandra Morrison's Legacy of Growth and Renewal," with forewords by both of you. The book represented another branch of their expanding mission, sharing Alexandra's wisdom with an even wider audience. Her gardening journals, once private reflections, had been transformed into a guide for ethical living and personal growth, illustrated with photos of the gardens through all their seasons of change. "There's something else," Chen called from the reading nook. He held up a laptop showing their foundation's latest impact report. "The Lavender Initiative has been adopted by 50 major corporations worldwide. Corporate fraud rates are dropping in companies that implement our garden-based ethics programs." Rose smiled, remembering her own journey from desperation to purpose. Alexandra always said that truth, like lavender, has a way of spreading naturally, when given the right conditions to grow. As night fell, the garden's lighting system activated, creating a magical atmosphere. Thousands of tiny lights twinkled among the flowers, mirroring the stars appearing overhead. The effect was breathtaking, a perfect blend of natural beauty and thoughtful human enhancement, just like the foundation itself. "I have something to show you," Alexandra said softly, leading Rose to a newly completed section of the garden. Here water features created a gentle symphony of sound, and special night-blooming flowers added their fragrance to the lavender's eternal perfume. In the center stood a beautiful bronze plaque, its surface catching the garden lights. It read, "The Alexandra Morrison Foundation for Truth and Renewal, where authentic beauty blooms eternal, founded in love, preserved through courage, growing through truth." Below these words were two quotes. The first, from Alexandra's journal, "Gardens like truth will always find their way to the light." The second, added by Rose, "Every flower that blooms in adversity strengthens the garden of hope." "Perfect," Rose whispered, touching the words. Gently. "It captures everything we've become, everything we hope to be." Mrs. Rodriguez joined them, carrying Alexandra's favorite teapot for one final evening ritual. As they sat in the garden's embrace, sharing tea and memories, the night air seemed to pulse with possibility. Each bloom, each leaf, each tender shoot reaching toward the stars carried the promise of continued growth and renewal. "You know what I've learned?" Rose said, looking out over the gardens that had changed her life. "Truth isn't just about exposing a deception. It's about nurturing what's real, what's authentic, until it grows strong enough to transform everything around it." Alexandra nodded, understanding completely. Just like these gardens, they didn't just survive Sarah's attempt to erase them. They grew stronger, larger, more purposeful. Every challenge became an opportunity for new growth. As they sat together in the garden's gentle evening light, surrounded by the evidence of truth's triumph and beauty's persistence, they felt Alexandra's presence in every breath of lavender-scented air. Her vision hadn't just survived, it had evolved, adapted, and blossomed into something far more magnificent than anyone could have imagined. The gardens would continue to grow, touching more lives, healing more wounds, spreading truth and renewal across the globe. And at its heart would always be this place, where a simple flower seller's courage had transformed deception into opportunity, where truth had found its way to light, where authentic beauty bloomed eternal. In the gentle night breeze, the lavender swayed as if dancing to an eternal rhythm of growth and renewal, each purple bloom a testament to the enduring power of truth to transform, heal, and flourish in even the most challenging circumstances.